Let's break down 6 sneaky starts heading into week 12 of the 2024 fantasy football season. These may be players on your bench or players that you can grab off of the waiver wire, but ultimately they should provide some sneaky upside going into week 12. And then let's go over the best streaming options at quarterback and tight end for week 12 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick the video off with Kareem Hunt of the Kansas City Chiefs. And you might be thinking, well, Kareem Hunt has been an automatic start the past couple weeks, but I think most people know by now that we are expecting Isaiah Pacheco to come back onto the scene and make his return from injury here in week 12. There's a chance Isaiah Pacheco does not play in week 12, but he has been practicing in a limited capacity, and all signs are pointing towards his return this week, but we'll find out. Now, I think a lot of people who own Kareem Hunt, even in a great matchup, as you've seen on the screen, against the Carolina Panthers, who are giving up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs, still think some fantasy managers are pretty hesitant about starting Kareem Hunt this week. And I think that's fair if we do see Pacheco play. I do think that things will be split here. But as I said in the start-sit video for the running back position, I like Kareem Hunt more this week. I think they're going to kind of ease Pacheco back into things here. And a lot of that goal line, kind of tough yardage, third down yardage work will go to Kareem Hunt. And this is a smash matchup. And Hunt was fantastic in relief of Isaiah Pacheco, averaging 15.2 fantasy points per game. So if you're looking at your flex spot, your RB2 spot, you're struggling with the bye weeks this week, all of that stuff, and Kareem Hunt is hanging out on your bench, I still think he's a very startable player here in week 12 and has plenty of upside whether Pacheco plays or not due to this matchup against the Panthers, giving up the 32nd most fantasy points to the running back position. Next up, let's talk about Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals, who we last saw play in week 10 as the Cardinals had their bye week in week 11. But we look back to the past 2 games for the Arizona Cardinals, 12.5 points for Benson in week 9, 8 touches, a touchdown, 1 reception for 18 receiving yards. In week 10, 10.7 fantasy points, 10 touches, 62 rushing yards, and then 2 targets, 2 receptions for 25 receiving yards. Now, the game plan in week 9 was a little bit skewed. We saw the running backs get very involved. James Conner was still very involved. Amari DeMarcado was very involved. And then in week 10, Benson got some additional touches because, well, the Cardinals were beating up on the Jets. So kind of difficult to call if this is going to be a consistent thing here or if that was kind of contingent on the game plan and or the overall game script that we got against the Bears and the Jets. But nonetheless, this is a good matchup in week 12 against the Seattle Seahawks. And one thing I've talked about for the past couple weeks is we kind of get to this point in the season where you do see more lead backs start to get kind of spelled and more backup running backs get touches as the season starts to progress here, and teams that are making a push for the playoffs want to try and preserve their RB1 for the playoffs. So I won't be surprised if we continue to see involvement out of Trey Benson, and I won't be surprised if we get somewhere between 8 and 12 fantasy points out of Benson here in week 12 in a good matchup. But there's a lot of risk here. This is more of a desperation play. But if we're looking at the handcuff running backs that you may be rostering who do have some standalone value here in week 12, if you're struggling due to the bye weeks and you need somebody to fill in, Trey Benson might just be your best option here in week 12. All right, last running back I'm going to mention is Justice Hill of the Baltimore Ravens, who I will start by saying has been limited this week in practice as he's been coming out of concussion protocol. But overall, he does have 2 more opportunities to clear concussion protocol on the week. And this is a nice little primetime game we're going to get between the Chargers and the Ravens, and I'm expecting a good game script here. I'm also expecting the potential for this to be one of those games where the Ravens do need to throw the football a little bit more. And that's what we want if we're going to risk Justice Hill. We look at Justice Hill on the season, right? Week 1, 11.5 fantasy points. Week 4, 21.6 fantasy points. Week 7, 13.8. Week 9, 8.8. Week 11, 8.1. Those were all competitive game scripts against the Chiefs, the Bills, the Broncos, the Buccaneers, and this past week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And those are the games that we've seen the most involvement out of Justice Hill in. Also, some of those same matchups were kind of stiffer matchups for the running back position, but more specifically for Derrick Henry. And we've seen more plays in those games where we see Justice Hill come in relief and kind of get more involved in the passing game. We saw 7 targets last week, for example, for Justice Hill against the Steelers and 4 receptions. So all I'm really saying is if Hill is healthy this week, he sits at 31% roster, and you're kind of looking at your matchup or your lineup, and there's just nothing there due to the bye weeks, and you need somebody to fill in this week, get you a couple points, and hopefully push you into the next week. I think Justice Hill is your best option at running back to grab off of waivers. Plug in and cross your fingers in a competitive matchup, in a good game script against the Chargers on Sunday Night Football, and he at least gives you a chance to get through the week here in Week 12. Moving along to wide receiver, let's take a look at Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. If you guys watched the start-sit video at wide receiver, I was a little harsh on the Bears wide receivers, just really frustrated with the inconsistency that we've gotten out of this group on the season. But looking a little bit further into the week, this is a good matchup for Rome Odunze and DJ Moore, the way they line up against this Vikings defense. And Rome Odunze, 10 targets this past week. That was the most targets out of any of the Bears wide receivers. DJ Moore, 7 targets. And then Keenan Allen, 8 targets. Rome Odunze finished with 6 receptions for 65 receiving yards, 12.5 fantasy points. So he has 12.5 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 4 starts. And like I said, it's been extremely inconsistent, difficult to trust, but this is a good matchup this week for Rome Odunze, who is 73% rostered, so still hanging out on a lot of rosters out there. I do think he could end up being a solid flex option this week in Week 12. Matchup is here. The Bears looked much better with a new offensive coordinator. Caleb Williams looked better overall, although he didn't throw any touchdowns, but still looked like the offense had more of a flow to it. And most importantly, the wide receivers were much more involved, and the scheming was a lot better for DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Rome Odunze. But I think Odunze is kind of the sneaky one here. Put together a nice game this past week. It's a good matchup for him against the Vikings secondary. If you own him, this is one of those other players that I think could actually end up getting you through this biocalypse if you're dealing with some issues at the flex spot, wide receiver 2 spot, whatever it may be. Rome Odunze, I think, is a nice sneaky start with some good upside here in Week 12. And one sneaky line on Underdog this week is going to be Rome Odunze's total reception, sitting at 3.5. He's hit that in 2 of his last 4 matchups, and in the 2 matchups he didn't hit it, he was right under with 3 total receptions, 6 or more targets in the last 4 starts for Rome Odunze as well, and this is a smash matchup for him in Week 12, and we should get a good game script that kind of forces the Bears to throw the football this week as well. So I like Rome Odunze's line on Underdog for his total receptions. If you don't know, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch are getting a free NFL Pick Em for Week 12's action. Take your free Pick Em. Take the over on Rome Odunze's total receptions. Once both lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up on Underdog with promo code DCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, next up, I want to talk about Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. And this admittedly was a tough one to put on the list, but once again, this is a good matchup here. And you guys already heard me talk about Josh Downs in the must start video, and I do think there's some potential for Alec Pierce in this game as well, but you know, Pittman sits at 77% rostered, and he hasn't seen more than 9.6 fantasy points since week 6 of the season, but he did get 8 quality targets this past week against the Jets, turned that into 5 receptions, 46 receiving yards, 9.6 fantasy points, so nearly a double-digit performance, and this is a good matchup for him against the Detroit Lions secondary. Now, don't know exactly what form in the Lions defense we're going to get this week, but it's a home game for the Colts, and I think the secondary will bend a bit, and like I said, I'm expecting a good game out of Josh Downs. We always have that home run potential with Alec Pierce, who sits at 25% roster, but I think Pittman can piece together a solid fantasy outing this week. I think this is a player who, if you own him, you're probably not feeling overly confident in going into the week, but if he's hanging out on your bench, you may want to take a look at the matchup here. I think this could be the game where Pittman scores his third touchdown on the season, as he's only scored 2 receiving touchdowns on the year so far, but this is a solid matchup for him. I think that this offense starting to maybe roll a little bit, have a little bit more confidence and flow to it with Anthony Richardson back. Hopefully we don't get a disaster against this Lions defense, but ultimately I think this is a good spot for Pittman. If you're too scared to start him, I think give him a chance. He could have some nice sneaky upside here in week 12. All right, last but not least, we started with a Chiefs player. Let's end with a Chiefs player. Let's take a look at Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs, who finished with a very nice fantasy day in Week 11, his second best of the season, with 16.8 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 61 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He's been extremely hard to trust. 2.1 points in Week 10, -1 in Week 9, double-digit performance touchdown in Week 8 with 13.7 fantasy points, 5.4 the week before having at least 11.8 or more in 3 out of his first 5 games on the season. So been a very up and down season for Xavier Worthy in his rookie year. A lot of changes in this offense as the year has progressed with injuries and everything. He's your wide receiver 36 on the season. He never really feels good to start. I mean, we literally went from a total of 1.1 points between weeks 9 and 10 to 16.8 this past week. I mean, it is a very risky start when it comes to Worthy. But although the Panthers come in 14th against opposing wide receivers on the season, that number doesn't really scare me. I mean, we've really seen so many teams start to just run the football against them that number is a little bit skewed. But overall, Xavier Worthy also gets a little bit involved near the goal line in terms of potential touchdowns, right? We've seen those handoffs and kind of drawn up plays for Xavier Worthy, and this matchup really fits that mold. We might see Xavier Worthy involved in terms of the red zone offense here in Week 12. And overall, once again, this matchup against the Panthers just does not scare me. The Chiefs coming off of their first loss on the season. I'm not saying they're just going to come out here and blow out the Panthers or anything. I think that's what a lot of people are expecting, but this game might be more competitive than some people are thinking, but this is still a good matchup at the end of the day for the Chiefs offensive players. And if you own Xavier Worthy, there's a lot of risk here, but I think this could be another big week for Xavier Worthy. So if you own him, he is basically the definition of sneaky upside as we get into Week 12. All right, very quickly, let's take a look at our streaming options at quarterback and tight end for the week. We've talked a ton about Bo Nix on the channel dating back to Weeks 5 and 6. We've talked about Bo Nix as a streaming option for weeks and weeks, and he has shot up to 74% rostered. Unlikely that you're going to get him on the waiver wire, but if you need to roll with Bo Nix, your QB7 so far on the fantasy season, who's had 16 or more fantasy points in every game but one since Week 5, 18 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 5 except for 2. He's a strong start against the Las Vegas Raiders this week. If you own Nix, not a whole lot to fear here. He is set for another solid fantasy outing. I don't think we're going to really be calling him a streaming option past this week, just a start or maybe sit due to matchup. Then we got Tommy DeVito. I know this one's risky, but if you're in a super flex, double quarterback league, maybe all your quarterbacks are on bye week this week. Maybe you own just Joe Burrow. Maybe you own just Josh Allen. Maybe it's very thin out there on waivers. This is a smash matchup. The Buccaneers, the worst team in the league against quarterbacks in fantasy, a bottom 5 unit against wide receivers when it comes to fantasy. They've moved back to bottom 6 against the running back position. This defense has just not looked good as of late. Tommy DeVito, I think, could come through with a surprising stat line this week. He's definitely the riskiest of any of the quarterbacks on the screen, but his matchup is the best of any quarterback on the screen. So if you're in a desperation situation, I think you can roll with him. In one of my main Dynasty Superflex leagues, I have Burrow, Purdy, and Prescott. Had to go in on DeVito on waivers, and right now he's starting for me. So It's how it rolls sometimes. Let's move along to Anthony Richardson, who's coming off of a 28 fantasy performance against the New York Jets. 20 of 30, 272 passing yards, a touchdown, 32 yards on the ground, and 2 rushing touchdowns. A very bad matchup against the Lions, allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but the upsides there. Richardson, player that can get it done with his legs, can at times get it done through the air like we saw this past week. Like we talked about earlier in the video, it's a good matchup for those Colts wide receivers. So Richardson's moved up to 54% rostered. If you got to roll with him this week, hey, the upside's there. The risk is there too. But I do like him this week for what it's worth in terms of a streaming option. Then we got Tua Tagovailoa coming off of a 25.3 fantasy performance against the Las Vegas Raiders, a team that Bo Nix is going to face. He was 28 of 36 and 3 passing touchdowns. That's basically it. Had a fumble that was not lost. But a little bit of a tougher matchup here. The Patriots allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But I think that Tua can come through with a respectable stat line. We look, since he's returned from concussion, it's been a little bit up and down, 14, 17.5, 9.1, 23.5. I think he can get into that 16, 17, 18 type range this week here in Week 12. I didn't put Matthew Stafford on the list, but I don't really trust him against the Eagles. That's why this is my least favorite of matchups for potential streaming quarterbacks, but Stafford might be a guy that you can take a look at as well this week. Moving along to tight ends, Will Dissly, my number one streaming option at tight end going into the week. We talked about him in last week's last-minute waiver wire video. He sits at 46% rostered. He had 18 fantasy points against the Bengals in Week 11. 6 targets, 4 receptions, 80 receiving yards, a touchdown. Gets the Ravens this week, a unit that's got a little bit better against tight ends, but they're still giving up the 24th most fantasy points to tight ends. Primetime game, like this matchup, like this game script. If Dissly's out there, really like him this week. We also talked about Hunter Henry in last week's streaming options video, as well as the last minute waiver video. He sits at 50% rostered, 12.3 points in Week 11, 9 targets, 6 grabs, 63 receiving yards. He has double digits in every full game Drake May has started, except for Week 10 against the Bears, one of the best teams in the NFL against opposing tight ends. So it's a good enough matchup here. The Dolphins giving up the 20th most points to the position. Henry, another tight end that I like a lot this week. Johnny Smith has shot up to 71% rostered, coming off of a very high ceiling performance game, 28.1 fantasy points. We do want to look, since Week 5, he's only had double digits 3 times. We did have a little stretch there, 6 points, 9.6. 7.5. But ultimately, he's been fantastic. He's a top 10 tight end on the season. I think he's kind of getting in that range. We're not really going to be calling him a streaming option, but he's also one of these tight ends that maybe you picked up and you already have a stud at tight end. You're trying to make those decisions. So he gets the Patriots. They're giving up the 11th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. It is kind of a tough matchup at home here, but he's coming off of that big game, 2 touchdowns, hard to ignore. So if you own Johnny Smith, I think he's a very strong start this week. Then last but not least, a tight end we've talked about a lot throughout the course of the season, Zach Ertz, coming off of his best game of the season against the Eagles. 18.7 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 grabs, a touchdown, 47 receiving yards. Cowboys ranked 15th against the tight end position in fantasy, but that Cowboys team does not scare me whatsoever. The Commanders coming off of 2 losses. They're going to come out strong at home against the Cowboys is my prediction. I think Zach Ertz is as good of a streaming option at tight end that you're going to find here in Week 12. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 6 sneaky starts heading into Week 12 of the 2024 fantasy football season, and my favorite streaming options at quarterback and tight end moving into Week 12 as well. As always, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because we're going to have everything for the rest of the week that you could possibly need to dominate Week 12 of the fantasy season. So be sure to hit that subscribe button on the way out and check out the rest of the content for the week as well. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, saw it here on The Catch.